Welcome to Tony Style Motivation, the place where silence becomes strength and clarity becomes your comeback. Welcome to the moment your silence becomes your power. This isn't just another message, this is the shift. The quiet move they never expected. And today, we're diving into a truth that most people overlook. Sometimes the loudest impact comes from the message you send when you finally stop chasing. Because when you're done over-explaining, when you're done proving, when you're done trying to be chosen, that's when you drop the quiet text that echoes louder than anything you've ever said before. This isn't about guilt. This isn't about drama. It's about rising with grace, with clarity, with unstoppable energy. It's about becoming the kind of person who doesn't need closure. Because you are the closure, let's get into it. You ever notice how silence has a way of saying everything? How sometimes the absence of noise, of effort, of explanation, speaks louder than all the shouting in the world? When it comes to avoidance, those people who withdraw, go cold, disconnect just when you start to get close, there's a moment that flips the script. And it's not when you finally get them to open up. It's not when you beg them to come back. It's not when you pour your heart out. It's when you stop and send a message so quiet, so composed, that it stops them in their tracks, because they're not wired for peace. They're wired for protection. They expect the same chase you've given them before. The same emotionally charged paragraphs, the same anxious questions, the same fight to keep something alive that they keep starving. That's the rhythm they know. So when you go silent, and then finally speak with a calm, centered energy that doesn't seek or plead, it disrupts their internal blueprint. It breaks their pattern. That one quiet message hits them in a place they didn't expect, their own illusion of control. See, it's not just about what you say. It's how you say it, and who you are when you say it. When you send a message that's no longer about trying to fix the dynamic, and instead simply reflects clarity, acceptance, and emotional detachment. That's when you take back your power. Not to punish, not to manipulate, but because you've finally outgrown the chaos, and that's what rattles them more than anything. Not that you're angry, not that you're hurt, but that you're still, you're grounded, and you're done. It's like this. They're standing in a storm of their own making, and for the first time, you're not standing there with them. You're on solid ground. You're not reacting to their silence. You've owned it. You're not waiting for their approval. You've reclaimed your own. That one quiet text, maybe just a few lines, doesn't scream for them to change. It simply says, I see what this is, and I'm no longer chasing what won't meet me. That hits them hard, because it's not about pressure. It's not about conflict. It's about peace. And peace is something avoidants don't know how to sit with, especially when it's coming from the person they thought they could keep spinning in confusion. They don't expect stillness from you. They don't expect you to stop proving your worth. They don't expect you to show up with emotional precision. But when you do, it echoes, over and over again. That one quiet text isn't something they delete and move on from. No, it lingers, because for the first time they don't know how to respond. You've taken your energy off them. And now they're left with themselves. It's not about the words, it's the energy behind them. You could say something as simple as, I understand, I won't reach out again, take care. And boom, that's the impact, because it's not laced with emotion. It's not loaded with subtext. It's pure. Detached, final. It doesn't try to reopen a door. It closes it with grace, and that's the real shift. You're not waiting outside anymore, hoping they'll let you in. You've walked away from the house altogether, and here's the thing. When that message is sent from a place of truth, not performance, it transforms you. You don't send it to get a reaction. You don't send it hoping they'll text back. You send it because you've made peace with what is. Because you've realized that your energy is sacred, your time is valuable, and your love, your real open-hearted love, is not something that should be begging to be received. Avoidants are masters of emotional distance, but they aren't immune to presence. When your message carries the full weight of your evolved energy, when it's laced with stillness, not struggle, They feel it. Deeply, not always immediately, but it sinks in, because they know they lost something rare. Someone who could have loved them powerfully, but chose to love themselves more. That quiet text, it's not just a message, it's a declaration. It says, I've returned home to me. And in that moment, you are no longer the seeker. You are the standard. And that's when they hear you the loudest, because for the first time, you've gone silent with power, not pain. You want to know the moment everything shifts. It's not when you finally get the response you were waiting on. It's not when they suddenly open up and validate all the things you've been dying to hear. The real shift, the permanent one, happens when you stop chasing clarity and start embodying it. When you stop trying to get them to reflect, and instead reflect truth through the way you carry yourself. That's when you stop asking for attention and start commanding respect. And that's when your quiet message doesn't just hit, it shakes their foundation. Because let's be honest, when someone with an avoidant attachment style creates distance, it's not random. It's strategic, subconscious maybe, but strategic. They pull back when they feel emotionally unsafe, when intimacy feels like a threat. And the more you push in, the more they pull away. That becomes the dynamic. Your pursuit feeds their retreat. You text, they delay. You express hurt, they stay silent. You send one more message just to be seen, just to be understood, and they feel more justified in their emotional shutdown. But what happens when you stop trying to pull them closer? What happens when instead of reaching for reassurance, you send one message quiet, composed without desperation, that lets them know you see everything clearly and you're choosing yourself now? That flips their whole system, because now they're no longer running from someone who needs them, they're faced with someone who doesn't. A message that says, I'm not going to chase someone who's not ready to meet me, or I care about you, but I care about my peace more. It doesn't scream for validation. It doesn't ask them to do anything. It just plants a mirror in front of them, a mirror they can't avoid. And in that mirror, they don't just see you, they see themselves, their patterns, their emotional avoidance, the connection they sabotaged, and for once, it's not you pointing it out, it's their own conscience. When you stop playing the emotional rescuer, when you stop begging for crumbs of connection, and instead lead with clarity, everything changes. Your one calm message becomes a silent challenge. Rise up or fade out, and that pressure, it's not applied forcefully, it's felt internally. Because the game they were winning by pulling away just ended, not because they lost, but because you left the field. It's funny, isn't it? The same person who could ignore you for days suddenly doesn't know what to do when you're not begging them anymore. That's not an accident, that's energy, because up until now, they've been in control of the emotional rhythm. They've dictated when conversations start, when they end, how deep it goes, how far it doesn't. But the moment you send something calm, not from your wounded self, but from your awakened self, they feel the shift in power. And it rattles their comfort zone. This isn't about playing games, it's about walking in truth. You're not trying to get them to reflect by using reverse psychology. You're not manipulating, you're leading by no longer settling, leading by showing that your emotions are valuable, but your peace is non-negotiable. That's what creates reflection, not force, not arguments, not over-explaining, just presence, just a message that doesn't ask for anything but speaks volumes. You don't need them to say, you were right. You don't need closure wrapped in a neat little reply. Your message is the closure, because what you're really saying underneath the words is, I know who I am now, and I'm not here to fight for love. I am love. That kind of clarity, you can't unread that. You can't unfeel that. Even if they pretend to be unaffected, it lingers. Because it marks the moment you stopped trying to pull them forward, and instead pulled yourself upward. And the best part, you no longer need their reflection to validate your growth. You're already in motion. already building, already rising, and maybe one day they'll get it. Maybe they won't, but that's no longer your concern. Because the message wasn't for them, it was from you to you, and that's why it left an impact. Avoidants don't fear your love. They fear what your love exposes in them. See, most people think if they just love harder, love louder, love more consistently, the avoidant will finally feel safe enough to stay. But love isn't the issue. The issue is that your emotional presence, your vulnerability, your desire for intimacy, it challenges their inner wiring. It threatens their emotional defense system. So what do? They armor up. They shut down. They create space, not because you did something wrong, but because closeness starts to feel like a trap to them. And that's what makes this dynamic so painful. You're trying to connect deeper, and they're trying to disconnect faster. So naturally, you get louder, you express more, you try harder, and what does that do? It just reinforces their need to run. Because avoidants don't respond to emotional noise, they respond to energetic shifts. They respond when your energy no longer seeks to pull them out of hiding, but instead becomes still. Composed, free. The mistake most people make is thinking the only way to break the cycle is by talking through it, pushing harder for clarity, explaining their worth over and over again. But that doesn't disarm the avoidant, that inflames them. What does disarm them is when your energy shifts from trying to get them to understand you to finally understanding yourself. When your calm becomes louder than your confusion, when your emotional detachment isn't passive, aggressive, it's peaceful. That's when they feel it. That's when they notice, not when you yell, not when you write long texts trying to fix things, but when you drop a single line grounded in clarity, a message like, "I'm not in the business of forcing connection," or "This space is giving me clarity too." That doesn't sound angry. It doesn't demand anything, but it hits. Because suddenly you're not trying to pull them back into closeness. They feel the gap. They finally feel it, and that gap doesn't come from drama. It comes from your decision to let go of the emotional tug-of-war. Avoidance can block out emotional chaos, but you know what they can't block: calm confidence, emotional elegance. The energy that says, "I'm not playing tug-of-war anymore because I don't need to prove anything." That presence sits like sunlight through their emotional fog. It cuts through, and not because you're trying to make a point, but because you've finally reached a place where you don't need to. This is the moment you go from being the pursuer to the mirror. You're no longer chasing validation. You're no longer begging to be seen. Now, your presence simply reflects who they are, and who they've chosen not to become. That's uncomfortable, not because you're attacking them, but because your stillness makes them sit with themselves. And that's what they've been avoiding all along. That one quiet message you send, it's not just a text, it's a shift. It's a signal that you've exited the battlefield, not because you lost, but because you realized the war wasn't yours to fight anymore. You're not throwing guilt, you're not manipulating, you're just saying, "I'm done explaining my worth." And when you say it with energy, not desperation, that's when it pierces the silence. You take the emotional high road, not to prove you're better, but because peace has become more valuable than potential. You're not here to force someone to love you. You're here to become someone who never needs to beg for it again. That's the move. That's the pivot. When your message carries more power in its peace than it ever did in your pain, you've already won. And now they're left to sit in the silence they created, facing the impact of a connection that no longer pleads, no longer waits, and no longer chases. Because the quietest energy you've ever sent became the loudest lesson they've ever felt. You ever hear something so clear, so simple, that it echoes for days? That's what happens when you send a message from truth, not turmoil, not with pressure, not with pain, but with presence. Avoidants are masters at tuning out the noise. They've trained themselves to detach when things get emotionally intense. That's their autopilot, that's their comfort zone. So when you come at them with long emotional paragraphs, trying to be heard, trying to be seen, they don't hear your heart. they hear volume. And that volume gets muted. But when you take all that energy, all that emotion, and distill it down to one grounded, clear message, something quiet, steady, without emotional hooks, they don't mute that. They can't, because now it's not coming from the version of you that's trying to hold on. It's coming from the version that's already let go. That energy, it cuts straight through. You don't need to prove your worth in 100 lines. You don't need to explain your side 10 different ways. The moment you stop performing for their attention and start communicating from your center, that's when your message becomes unforgettable. Not because it's clever, not because it's poetic, but because it's true, and truth, especially when it's not wrapped in drama, lingers. You can send one message like, "I respect where you are. I'm choosing peace now," and they'll read it over and over. Not because they're touched by your words, but because your energy is no longer grasping, it's no longer pulling. You've stepped out of their loop, and in doing that, you've stepped into your own power. Avoidants are used to emotional messiness. They expect it, they depend on it, because when things get loud, they justify their need to escape. But when you drop all of that and you choose clarity over clutter, they don't know what to do with it. You're not storming out, you're walking out with dignity, you're not slamming the door, you're closing it gently, and that quietness roars. That's when they start to feel what they were avoiding, not your words, your absence, not your pain, your strength. Because your message wasn't crafted to trigger guilt, it wasn't coded in pain, it was simply you, standing in truth, no longer trying to be understood, but already understanding yourself. And that's where the power is. You don't need to attack someone to make an impact. You don't need to dress your hurt in fancy language. When you speak from presence, you don't speak to force a reaction. You speak to release one. You speak to free yourself. And that's what they feel, that emotional freedom, that inner quiet. It hits different. It's not silence as a weapon. It's silence as wisdom. That message you send, it becomes a marker, a moment in time, and whether they show it or not, it gets replayed. Because now you're not the person chasing their attention. You're the person who realized your value isn't up for debate anymore. You've stopped fighting for space in someone's life who never offered it freely, and you've done it with grace. That grace is what stays with them. People remember emotional drama in flashes, but they remember emotional clarity forever. They remember the person who didn't scream, who didn't beg, who didn't collapse into emotion, but stood in it, owned it, and walked forward. That's what your quiet message is. It's not weak, it's not passive, it's anchored, and it tells a story without needing a reply. Because the most powerful messages aren't loud, they're clear, and clarity, when it comes from a healed place, is impossible to ignore. It doesn't beg to be answered, it is the answer. That's why your message doesn't need to ask, "Do you see me?" It says, "I see myself." And that's what leaves the loudest impact. You know what most people crave after a breakup, or after being shut out by someone with an avoidant attachment style? Closure, that final conversation, that explanation, that apology, something, anything, that gives them peace. But here's the truth most don't want to accept. Sometimes, the closure you need doesn't come from the other person. It comes from you, and the most powerful kind of closure, the one that doesn't ask for a response, the one that's complete the moment you send it. When you've been pulled into silence by someone avoidant, when you've gone through the confusion, the unanswered texts, the passive coldness, you start to internalize the idea that you're the one, waiting for them to come around, waiting for them to respond, waiting for that message that finally makes sense of it all. But what if that waiting is the very thing keeping you stuck? What if real freedom comes not when they reply, but when you no longer need them to? That's what energetic closure is. It's not the kind you beg for, it's the kind you choose. And it often starts with one simple message, not to provoke, not to seek validation, but to draw a clean line. A message that says, "This is where I stop giving my energy to confusion. This is where I honor my peace more than their silence." That message doesn't come from the version of you that's desperate to be heard. It comes from the version of you that has heard enough. When you send a message like that, when your energy has shifted and you no longer need anything from them, you reclaim your power. Because now the silence is no longer a weapon they're using on you. It's a space you've taken back. And that's a massive shift. They may still be silent, they may never reply, but suddenly you're no longer waiting. That's what changes everything. Avoidants are comfortable in emotional limbo. They know how to linger in the in-between. They're used to leaving the door half open while staying distant. But when you stop trying to walk through that door and instead close it gently from your side, they feel the difference. Because now you're not playing in the gray area, you're not lingering in maybe, you've chosen clarity, and that clarity becomes the message. That message doesn't demand anything, it simply expresses truth. You might say, "I wish you the best, but I can't keep investing in what doesn't grow." Or, "I care about you, but I won't chase what runs from me." It's short, it's grounded, and most importantly, it's final. Not in a dramatic way, not with bitterness, but with conviction. It lets them know you're done not in anger, but in self-respect. And here's the thing, when you're not expecting a reply, when you send that message purely as a release, the power is all yours. Because now you're not caught in the emotional loop. You've stepped out, you've drawn the boundary. And you've done it without slamming a door, without burning a bridge, without trying to win. You just chose you. That's the loudest move you'll ever make. They might read it and not respond. They might pretend not to care. But deep down they feel it. Because they didn't expect that strength from you. They expected more waiting, more hoping, more pulling, and instead they got peace. And peace, when it's real, makes people reflect in silence. Closure isn't about the other person understanding your pain. It's about you understanding your worth. It's about choosing not to bleed energy into someone who never gave you emotional safety. That message you send, it's not a request for resolution. It is the resolution because what you're really saying underneath it is, "This is the moment I stop needing anything from someone who couldn't meet me," and that's when you finally breathe. That's when you rise. That's when you're free. Because sometimes the most powerful way to end something isn't with a fight, or with fireworks, or with one last emotional plea. It's with stillness, with grace, with a message that asks for nothing and says everything. You ever notice how real power doesn't have to announce itself? It doesn't scream, it doesn't threaten, it doesn't chase, it just is. When you get to the point where your peace is louder than your pain, where your silence carries more strength than your words ever could, that's when everything shifts. That's when you stop reacting to the avoidant, and instead you start revealing who you've become. Avoidants expect certain moves. They're used to the cycle. They know the pattern, pull away, create distance, and the other person will start to scramble. You'll text more, get emotional, ask for answers, maybe even plead, and all of that gives them what they secretly depend on: control. But the moment you stop showing up with emotional chaos, the moment you show up with calm energy, with emotional elegance, that's the moment they feel the shift. They may not say it, they may not even know how to process it, but they feel it. That message you send quiet, clean, not seeking anything doesn't land like a whisper. It lands like a statement, a presence. It's not about being cold. It's not about playing games. It's about saying, "I'm not afraid to let go anymore." And that scares them more than any emotional explosion ever could, because now you're not trying to fight for them. You're just standing in who you are, and that is the deepest form of power there is. Avoidants are used to being the emotionally unavailable one. But when you send a message that says, "I'm good without this dynamic," in tone, not in attack, they don't know how to digest that. It throws their system out of alignment. Because you're no longer the chaser. You're no longer trying to fix or prove anything. Your energy has become refined, focused, elevated, and that elevation, that's what they feel most. Not your anger, not your sadness, but your detachment, not cold detachment, but conscious detachment, the kind that says, I honor myself too much to stay stuck in cycles that shrink me. That's the kind of message that echoes. That's the kind of energy they can't forget. You're not trying to punish them. You're just not participating anymore. You've stopped trying to teach them how to love you, and you've started showing up as someone who knows how to love themselves. You've stopped reacting and started leading with silence, with simplicity, with strength. And that shift. That's how you win, not over them. Over the part of you that thought you had to beg for connection to be worthy of it. The quiet text, the short message, the graceful goodbye. It doesn't say, please come back. It says, I've already returned to myself. And that kind of message, rooted in emotional elegance, doesn't just affect them. It transforms you. Because now, your value is no longer tied to their recognition. Your worth is no longer tied to their response. You've taken your power back. Not with a scream, but with stillness. They may not reply. They may act like nothing happened. But something did happen. The moment you stopped proving your worth and started protecting your energy, the moment you stopped explaining and just expressed from a place of truth, that's the moment you became someone they can't just shake off, because your energy now carries weight. It carries boundaries. It carries self-respect. And those things, they leave a deeper impact than any emotionally charged message ever could. This isn't about being heartless. It's about having a heart that's no longer willing to break just to be heard. It's about speaking from love but no longer losing yourself in it. It's about finally understanding that the person who wins in the end isn't the one who gets the last word. It's the one who rises in silence, the one who moves on without drama, the one who sends a message not to be answered, but to be honored. Because when you become the person who no longer fights for half love, that's when you finally make room for the love that matches your fullness. And now you've seen it for what it is. You've felt the silence, you've wrestled with the doubt, but you didn't break, you didn't beg, you rose. Because the quiet text wasn't just a message. It was your line in the sand. It was the moment you stopped giving away your power and took it all back. Not with noise, not with drama, but with emotional clarity so loud it left a mark they can't unfeel. That's the power of stillness. That's the weight of your worth. That's what happens when you stop chasing people and start choosing you. This is Tony, Style Motivation, where your silence isn't weakness. It's your greatest move. And now let them sit with the message.